The morning my son-in-law told me to stay out of my own kitchen. I was standing in it in my socks, holding a mug of coffee I'd just made, and I didn't say a word back to him. I just nodded, took my coffee to the back porch, sat down in the cold like I deserved to be out there. That moment didn't come from nowhere. It had been building for 2.5 years. I just hadn't wanted to see it. My name is not important. What I am is a 63-year-old retired electrician from Sudbury, Ontario, who spent 37 years doing honest work, raised a daughter on his own after her mother passed, and made one decision in his later years that turned everything upside down. Not out of stupidity, but out of love. You can do foolish things out of love. I'm proof of that. My daughter. I'll call her my daughter because that's all she is to me, my whole world for most of my life. Married a man named Patrick when she was 31. Patrick was from Barrie, worked in commercial real estate, drove a leased Audi, and had opinions about everything from wine to insulation. I didn't dislike him right away. That would come later. They had a son together, my grandson. He was 3 when all of this started, and he is the reason I stayed as long as I did. That boy looked at me like I hung the moon, and some mornings that was the only thing that got me out of bed. The arrangement started as a temporary thing. That's how these things always start. It was the spring of 2 years before last. My daughter called me on a Sunday afternoon and said Patrick's company had restructured and he'd been let go. They were behind 2 months on their mortgage in Barrie. They needed somewhere to land while they figured things out. "Just a few months, Dad," she said, "until Patrick gets back on his feet." I had a house in Sudbury, 3 bedrooms. Paid off. I'd bought it in 1998 and put new windows in it twice and a new roof once, and I knew every creak in every floorboard. It was mine in the way that only a house you've kept up with your own 2 hands can be yours. I said yes without hesitating. Of course I did. She was my daughter. They moved in the first weekend of May with a rental truck, and more boxes than I thought 3 people could own. My grandson ran through the hallway and called it an adventure. I made pasta that night, and we sat around the table like a real family, and I thought, this is going to be fine. This is going to be good even. For about 6 weeks it was. Patrick found some contract work, nothing full-time, but enough to keep him busy. My daughter picked up extra shifts at the dental office where she worked as an office manager. I watched my grandson in the mornings, drove him to daycare, picked him up, made dinner most nights. I didn't mind. I loved it, honestly. Having a child in the house again woke something up in me that I hadn't realized had gone quiet. But Patrick was not comfortable being helped. That's the most diplomatic way I know to say it. He was a man who needed to be the authority in whatever room he was standing in, and living in someone else's house made that impossible. So he compensated. It started small. He rearranged my garage without asking. Said it was more efficient. He switched the internet provider because he had a better deal in mind. The new one dropped out 3 times a week. He told my daughter in front of me at dinner that the house needed updating and that the kitchen layout was not functional. I had cooked 10,000 meals in that kitchen. It functioned fine. I let it go. They were stressed. Losing a job does things to people. I had been laid off once, back in 1994, and I remembered what that helplessness felt like. I gave him room. By September, Patrick still hadn't found full-time work, and they'd quietly stopped talking about the timeline. Nobody mentioned the few months anymore. Nobody mentioned Barrie. I didn't push it. I could see my daughter was embarrassed, and I didn't want to add to that. What I did do was start covering more. Groceries had always been shared loosely, but now I was doing all of it. Hydro, gas, property tax, those were always mine. But then my daughter mentioned quietly that they were behind on the Barrie mortgage, which they still hadn't sold, and that if they missed another payment it would go into default. I said I'd help. $4,200. That was the number. I transferred it from my savings without thinking twice. She was my daughter. You don't think twice. Looking back, that was the moment the dynamic changed, not loudly, not with any announcement. It just shifted, the way ice shifts in spring, slowly. Then all at once. By October, Patrick had stopped looking for work entirely, as far as I could tell. He was home most days, on his laptop, watching markets, talking about a business idea he had. He spoke about it vaguely, never with specifics, the way people talk about things they're not actually going to do. I asked about it once, and he told me it was complicated and I probably wouldn't understand the space. I nodded and went back to watching the news. My daughter said he just needed time to find the right opportunity. She said it in a tone that suggested I shouldn't ask again, so I didn't. What I did instead was keep paying. Groceries. The Barry mortgage again when it came up in December. Physio appointments for my daughter's back. New winter tires for the Audi, which Patrick said were a safety issue and therefore urgent. I didn't argue, I put it on the card. By February, I had spent just over $19,000 since they'd moved in. I know the number because I'm a careful man, and I kept records. Old habit from running my own small operation for a few years in the 90s. You write things down. But I hadn't looked at the total all at once until February, sitting at my kitchen table after everyone was asleep, doing my taxes. $19,412 in 11 months. I sat with that number for a long time. The kitchen was quiet. Outside it was -22, and the furnace was running. And somewhere upstairs my grandson was sleeping. I thought about my pension, which was decent but not enormous. I thought about my savings, which were supposed to last me through retirement, and weren't supposed to be doing this. I didn't say anything to anyone. I just closed my laptop and went to bed. That was my first mistake, staying quiet. I kept making it for another year. Patrick developed a habit of speaking to me the way people speak to someone they are tolerating. It wasn't loud. He never raised his voice. It was more like he had decided, somewhere in his own head, that I was a background character in his story, rather than the owner of the house he was living in for free. He would talk over me at the table. He would make decisions about the house, changing the thermostat settings, telling my daughter they should repaint the main floor, suggesting they turn the third bedroom into a home office for him, and present them to me as announcements rather than questions. Once in March, I moved a box of his things from the hallway to the basement because I'd tripped over it twice. He came to find me in the backyard afterward and asked me, calmly and coldly, not to touch his belongings. I tripped on it twice, I said. Then watch where you're going, he said. I stood there holding a pair of gardening gloves, and I did not say what I was thinking. I was thinking a great many things. But he went back inside and I stood in the yard for a while until I was sure my face had settled, and then I went back inside too. My daughter saw it happen. She didn't say anything. That was the one that landed differently, I think. Not because it was the worst moment. There were worse, but because of her silence. She had heard him. She had been in the kitchen doorway, and she had heard him speak to me that way in my own backyard, and she said nothing. She turned back to what she was doing. I had spent 12 years raising her alone, school lunches and sick days, and every single Christmas morning, just the two of us, before Patrick, before any of this. I was the one who drove her to her first job interview. I was in the waiting room when she had her appendix out. I flew to Vancouver when she called me crying at 2 in the morning, because she'd had a miscarriage before her son was born, and she didn't want to be alone. And she was standing in the kitchen doorway, and she said nothing. I went inside. I made dinner. I ate with them, and I smiled at my grandson, and I told myself this would pass. It did not pass. By the following autumn, 18 months in, I noticed things were not temporary in any sense anymore. The Barry house had finally sold, but the proceeds had gone to pay off credit card debt. Patrick told me with a tone that suggested this was simply what happens. And there was nothing more to discuss. There was no conversation about a timeline for their own place. My daughter had started referring to the room they were in as our room, which is what it was. But the way she said it had started to include the whole house in that hour. I heard her on the phone with a friend once describing where they lived, and she said the address, my address, and didn't add any qualifier. I needed to hear that to understand what had happened. I had become an inconvenience, living in what they had already decided was their house. There was an evening in November I think about often. Patrick had some friends over. Colleagues from a networking event, he said. 2 couples. They came over on a Friday evening, and Patrick had bought wine and charcuterie, which he expensed to the joint account that my daughter and I shared for household costs. I discovered this later. That evening I came downstairs at 7 to make tea and found 6 people in my living room, music playing, the good glasses out of the cabinet. Patrick introduced me to his friends with a half wave and said, "This is my father-in-law. He lives here with us." He lives here with us. I smiled at his friends. I said it was nice to meet them. I took my tea back upstairs, and I sat in my room and I thought about that sentence for a long time. He lives here with us, in my house, that I paid off, that I have owned for 26 years. I thought about calling my daughter in and saying something, but she was down there laughing, and I didn't want to ruin her evening. I turned the television on low. I listened to them through the floor until almost 11. The following morning was when the kitchen incident happened. I was up first, the way I always am, old habit, early riser. And I'd started the kettle, and was standing in my socks with my coffee when Patrick came downstairs and told me he and his friends had had a late night and he'd like some quiet in the kitchen for the next while. He said it the way you'd say it to a guest who didn't understand the social norms of your home. He said it in my kitchen. I took my coffee to the back porch. It was -6. I sat there in my coat over my pajamas, and I looked at the yard I'd mown for 26 years, and something settled in me. Not anger, exactly. More like clarity. The kind that comes too late but at least has the courtesy to arrive. I went inside after 20 minutes. I didn't go back to the kitchen. I went upstairs and I sat at my desk, and I opened a document on my computer, and I started writing down every dollar I had spent since they'd moved in. $27,860 across 22 months. I looked at that number for a long time. Then I closed the document, saved it, and I called my old friend Real. He's a retired paralegal, been a friend since we were 22 years old, sharp as a tack, and I told him what had been happening. All of it. Not the softened version I'd been telling myself, but the real version. Real was quiet for a moment when I finished. Then he said, "You know you don't have to stay in your own house, right?" I said I knew, but I'd been acting like I didn't. He asked me if I wanted to do something about it, or just needed to talk. I told him I wanted to do something about it. He said, "Good." He said to call him back in a few days when I'd thought through what I wanted. I spent 3 days thinking. I did not tell my daughter. I did not tell Patrick. I went about the house the same way I always did. Made coffee, watched the morning news, played with my grandson in the afternoon while my daughter was at work. Patrick mostly ignored me, which was his usual, and I let him. But I was making a list. Not an angry list, a clear-headed one. I would stop covering household expenses beyond my own share of utilities. I would close the joint account with my daughter. I would have a conversation, a real one, about a timeline. And if nothing changed, I was going to do something I had not let myself think about clearly until Real said it out loud. I was going to ask them to leave. It's a strange thing to plan to tell your daughter to leave your house. I didn't feel righteous about it. I didn't feel good about it. I felt something more like grief, to be honest. Like I was acknowledging that the relationship had already become something else, and I was only now catching up to the reality of it. On a Thursday morning in the second week of December, I sat down at the kitchen table, and I waited for my daughter. Patrick had taken my grandson to school. That was the one thing he did consistently, the school run, and she was still home. She came downstairs and poured her coffee, and seemed surprised to see me sitting there waiting. I told her to sit down. I said I needed to talk to her. I kept it simple. I told her I loved her. I told her I was glad they had a safe place to land when things got hard, and I had meant every dollar I'd spent. But I said that this had gone on long enough that it wasn't temporary anymore, and I needed them to make a plan. A real one, with a date, for their own place. I said I would help them with first and last if it came to that. But I needed this to move forward. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Dad, you knew what you were signing up for." I asked her what that meant. She said Patrick was still establishing himself, and it wasn't fair of me to add pressure. I said I wasn't trying to add pressure. I was trying to have a conversation I should have had a year ago. She said Patrick had already looked at places, and nothing was in their range right now. I said, "What is your range?" She didn't answer. I said, "Are you saving anything?" She looked at her coffee. I said, "I need a date, sweetheart. I'm not asking you to leave tomorrow. I'm asking you to give me a date." She said she'd talked to Patrick. 2 days went by. Nobody talked to me. Patrick was normal, which is to say he was barely present. My daughter was quieter than usual, and she had the look she'd had when she was a teenager and had done something she didn't want to discuss. I recognized it. On the Saturday, I came downstairs to find them both at the table, and Patrick looked at me with the particular expression of someone who has decided they are about to set something straight. He said my daughter had told him about our conversation. He said he understood I was feeling some anxiety about the living situation. He said they had looked at their finances carefully, and realistically, they were looking at another 12 to 18 months before a move made sense. He said he hoped I could understand that, and that in the meantime, they would try to be more considerate about, quote, the communal spaces. Communal spaces. He said 12 to 18 months like it was a medical estimate, like it was simply a fact I needed to absorb. I looked at my daughter. She was looking at her hands. I said, "I appreciate you laying that out. I want you both to know that I will need you to be in your own place by April. That's 4 months. I'll help with costs. I'll be a reference. I'll do whatever I can to help make that happen. But April is the date." Patrick said April wasn't realistic. I said I understood, and I was giving it to them anyway. I got up, put my coffee mug in the dishwasher, and went upstairs. He didn't speak to me for 4 days. My daughter spoke to me only about my grandson, daycare pickups, what he'd eaten, whether he had his gloves, nothing else. The house was very quiet in a way that was different from the quiet I'd always liked. This was a held breath quiet. I called my bank the following week. I separated my accounts, closed the joint account with my daughter, changed the household expenses back to my name only, hydro, gas, internet, and I stopped contributing to groceries beyond what I personally ate. I didn't announce any of this. I just did it. The grocery bill landed differently the following week when my daughter went to pick up the order and the card didn't go through the way it usually did. She asked me about it that evening. I told her I'd made some changes to my finances and that I thought, given the conversation we'd had, it made sense for them to manage their own expenses going forward. She stared at me for a long time. She said, "Dad, we're your family." I said, "I know, April." Christmas came. It was not warm. We exchanged gifts around the tree for my grandson's sake, and I made my usual turkey, with stuffing and roasted potatoes the way I always did. Because whatever else was happening, the boy was going to have a proper Christmas. He was 4, and he didn't know anything was wrong, and I was glad for that. Patrick's parents drove up from Barrie on Boxing Day. They stayed 2 nights in my house, in the room I'd been using as a study, which had been quietly converted into a spare room at some point without anyone asking me. I said nothing. I shook his father's hand. I chatted with his mother about the weather and the drive up. I made a big breakfast both mornings. I was cordial. But I had a date in my head, April, and it had the quality of something solid. In the last week of January, my daughter came to find me in the backyard, where I was clearing ice off the walkway. She stood on the steps and she said Patrick had been offered a position, full-time, salaried, with a commercial real estate firm in Barrie, actually. So there was some symmetry in that. She said it was a real offer, good pay. She said they'd been looking at rentals and had found a townhouse that would work. She said this all in a tone that was businesslike, slightly defensive, as though she was reporting rather than sharing. Then she said very quietly, "I'm sorry it took this long, Dad." I stopped scraping the ice. I looked at her. She was looking at the middle distance, the way people do when they're saying something that costs them. I said it did take too long. She nodded. I said, "But I should have said something sooner." She nodded again. Then she went inside. We didn't hug. We didn't have a big moment. I'm not sure what I expected. Maybe nothing. Maybe I'd stopped expecting things somewhere along the way without noticing. They moved out the first weekend of March, 3 weeks before my April deadline. I rented a cargo van and helped load it without being asked. My son-in-law and I didn't speak much, just the logistics of furniture and boxes, and who was taking the back end of the sectional. He shook my hand when the truck was loaded and he said, "Thanks for everything." It was the only genuine thing I can remember him saying to me in 2.5 years. I said, "Take care of her." He said he would. I watched the van until it was out of sight. Then I went back inside. The house was very quiet. A different kind of quiet this time. The kind I recognized from before, that I had lived in comfortably for years. I walked through the main floor in my socks and it was mine again in all the small ways. The thermostat set to 68, where I like it, the good glasses back in the right cabinet, the remote control on my chair and not pushed behind a cushion. I put the kettle on. I sat at the kitchen table with my tea, and I didn't have to take it anywhere. I thought about my grandson, who had cried when he hugged me goodbye and asked if he could still come visit. I said yes. Of course he could. He would come for every school break, and every summer he wanted to, and I would make pasta and we would go fishing at Ramsey Lake, the way I'd always meant to take him, and none of that was going away. But I also thought about those 3 years of my life and what they had cost me, in dollars, but in other things too. My quiet, my mornings, the small freedoms of living alone that you only notice when they're gone. Eating cereal for dinner if you feel like it. Leaving a book open on the kitchen table for 3 days, sitting in the backyard at 11 at night for no reason. $27,860. And I never once asked for a cent of it back. I don't know if I should have held my line sooner. Probably. Real told me so directly and he was right. But I also know that the situation crept up on me the way those situations do. One reasonable accommodation at a time. Each one defensible on its own, until you look up and find you have given over something you didn't mean to give. What I know now is this. Love is not the same as endless accommodation. You can love your daughter completely and still say, "This is my house, and you cannot treat me like a tenant in it." Those two things can both be true. It took me too long to say them out loud, but I said them. And the morning after they left, I woke up at 6:15 the way I always do, and I went downstairs, and I stood in my kitchen in my socks with my coffee, and there was nobody there to tell me to leave. I stood there for a long time. It felt like finding something I'd put down and forgotten about. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter than that. Something that was just mine.